Hi, Jacques.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm Sarah Posner with Religion Dispatches, and my guest today is Jacques Berlinerblau. He is professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and he's the director of the program for Jewish civilization there. He is the author of the new book, and I'm going to do the Bob Wright thing where I put it up to the camera,
Okay.
How to Be Secular, A Call to Arms for Religious Freedom. And I read the book with great interest because, of course, if anybody reads my work regularly, they know that's all religious freedom, secularism, all this is of great interest to me. And I thought it was very intriguing. There were some things that I didn't necessarily agree with or had some questions about, and we'll talk about all of that. So anyway, late in the book, where you have a chapter that is somewhat prescriptive, and you have some chapters that are also historical and very fascinating, but towards the end, you said, and this is a quote, secularism needs to check into rehab. So you are a secularist, or as you use in the book, the term secularish, right. Which I really liked. So what do you mean that secularism needs to check into rehab?
Well, I think the movement, and of course, thank you, Sarah, for picking this book and for introducing me to Blogging Heads and for having me. I'm really excited to be doing this. Yeah, I think that the secular movement, if you look at it from the 60s, I think the high watermark was probably John F. Kennedy's 1960 address, where he said, I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. If you look at the trajectory from 1960 to 2012, I guess it would be, in a word, downward. I mean, that's the best way I could describe it, right? As far as we understand secularism as a social movement, as a political worldview, things have not gone well for secularism. The whole checking... I'm sorry.
Go ahead. The checking into rehab.
Yeah, the whole checking into rehab thing is, well, it's the prelude to a 12-step program. So I try to identify, 12 things that secularism could do to get itself out of its funk.
Right. Well, before we get there, I just wanted to lay that out because I wanted to lay out the fact that you believe in secularism and you believe we should have a secular government, but you think that right now secularism or secularism right. as a movement has some problems. Now, you early on in the book, you have some deep criticisms of new atheists and right. the role that they've had, in your view, in giving secularism a bad name.
Right.
Is that like a fair?
It's fair, but
summary of your argument?
Absolutely. I mean, the book, I'm happy about this. The book has caught on, but a lot of what is catching on are the paragraphs about new atheism. I want to be very clear. I counted. There are only 12 paragraphs in the book about new atheism.
And unsurprisingly, right. 12 paragraphs are enough to cause a lot of discussion about what you think about the new atheists.
Absolutely, because the new atheists sell and they're interesting and this and that, right? But new atheism is not really at the core of the problem. But since we're there, all right, let's deal right. with it. I think what the new atheists did, among other things, is, well, they just took the name secularism, and that's probably because nobody else at that particular moment wanted it. And a kind of colloquial or journalistic or popular or even professorial equation set in, whereby secularism was atheism. And secularism has never been atheism, and that's a very, right. very big problem.
They're two different things.
Two right. very, very different things, and they're both good things.
Some secularists,
excuse me?
Some secularists are atheists. But
Absolutely.
Not all secularists are atheists, right?
Right. That's the best way to describe it. And I want to be very clear, right? Atheism is a good thing. No complaints here, right? But right. secularism and atheism, they have discrete histories. They have discrete worldviews. They have discrete goals. They often come together for political reasons. But it's really important at this moment to disentangle or disarticulate the two.
Why?
Well, because the movement needs people. I think that's one of my recommendations in the 12-step program. Right? Not many Americans are pretty content calling themselves secularists, right? The history of American secularism is a history of religious groups who have advocated on behalf of a variant of secularism known as separationism, right? Those were Baptists.
Right, and that used to be the Baptists, right? I was about to say.
Right.
It might surprise some people that used to be the Baptists because now they're not, the Southern Baptists at least, are not there.
Right,
as a
the Southern
denomination.
Baptists decamped around 1990. You know, what we need to do, Sarah, honestly, is we have to, like, you know, sequence the genome of American secularism, because very little is known about it. That's what came up in this book. There are very few books that would explain where it came from.
Was that one of the 12? Was that one of the 12 things Watson and Crick for the secularists?
Yes, yes, sequence the genome, exactly. Get to the DNA level. Actually, it was like 12B or something. Like, where are the intellectuals? All right, so back to the New Atheist. Yeah, I do think that the popular colloquial association between New Atheism, which is a very strident, kind of very in-your-face, and, you know, good for the New Atheists, God bless them.
And we're talking about people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. And
Absolutely,
right.
absolutely. And I think the problem is that those movements, at least according to Pew Survey research, they're extremely unpopular, right? So if you have atheists, a very particular type of atheist, speaking on behalf of a much larger and different thing, which is secularism, well, that's not going to accrue to the greater good of the movement, especially the mobilization aspect, which I think is really kind of important.
Right. Well, I think that there are two different historical reasons why you think that secularism is in trouble. One of them is, one of them is caused, I think, by, and I would agree with you here, that it's caused by the rise of the Christian right. You call them the Christian revivalists, who believe in that we're living in a third great awakening, and but that have also mobilized politically, mobilized to help with get judicial appointments to the Supreme Court, which undermine jurists who favor undermining the separation of church and state. But that politically speaking, the rise of the Christian right has helped to demonize secularism through equating it with atheism and godlessness and communism and all sorts of terrible things. President Obama, terrible things that the Christian right doesn't like. But you also seem to place some blame with secularists themselves, or with the lack of a coherent movement. Maybe you can explain that a little more, like why you think that despite the fact that there are organizations, membership organizations who engage in lobbying and advocacy and so on, like Americans United for the Separation of Church and State or the Secular Coalition for America, why you think that from a movement perspective, it's in trouble.
Yeah, well, the movement of late is getting its act together. Now, it's interesting. Americans United for Separation of Church and State, I actually praise in the book, and I praise their,
yes.
Their director, Barry Lynn. You know, I think they're really, really knowledgeable, and they're kind of punching way above their weight. I mean, they're a small, underfunded group. My one kind of concern with AU is that sometimes they seem to cleave to an idea of total separation of church and state. And I deal in the book with the kind of impossibility of that worldview, and if secularism is ever going to grow up, it's going to have to understand that we've never had total separation of church and state in the United States, and we'll never have it, and it's an unreasonable goal. Now, in terms
we'll come back to that discussion.
Oh, we certainly will. But in terms of the movement, here's something interesting. I don't know what was going on secularly on the ground in response to the Christian right in the 80s and the 90s. I mean, I know of groups like AU. Let's see, what was it? Why am I blocking the name? Americans for blah blah. The group with Norman Lear, Americans for
People for the American Way.
Yeah, right, right. For the People for the American Way. There was the Democratic Party. It's very hard for me to figure out, and I couldn't figure it out at the end of the book, who was looking at the Christian right in the 80s and 90s, right? And as opposed to raising alarms, was kind of efficaciously saying, okay, we've got to think here. This is not a joke. These people aren't kidding around, right? They're very organized. They're very well funded. They're very focused on their goals. And I think there was a kind of collapse in the 80s and 90s of the secular movement. And my analysis is, and this goes back to earlier chapters in the book, that the great achievements of American secularism occurred in the judicial realm, and only in that realm. In other words, how did America become more separationist secular? Because of the United States Supreme Court, and particularly the Warren Court, particularly in the 60s, a variety of decisions which moved the Bible out of public schools, which really took religion
officially
out of public
sanctioned
spaces.
school prayer, right? Mm-hmm.
So this was really great. Now, that we'll call that the judicial strategy. The problem with the judicial strategy, Sarah, is it wasn't coupled, as far as I could tell, with a legislative strategy, right? So you had the United States Supreme Court coming to conclusions about how our country should respect Mr. Jefferson's wall of separation. But I couldn't find any corresponding, shall we say, symmetry in terms of people on the ground, all right, who were like, yeah, we really want there to be this type of separation. We really want that Bible out of our schools, right? Poll after poll indicates to me that Americans didn't buy into the secular vision. So I use the term the Wizard of Oz, and I think it's kind of like in the 80s and 90s when the Christian right started ransacking the place and they started looking around, they found a secular movement that was bigger than that was smaller than it actually looked, right? It looked immense, right? But if you actually drill down, the organizations that represented secular ideals were very different and poorly coordinated and very, very small.
Okay. Today, I got an email from the Family Research Council, which read, in part, the left is launching a massive effort to enact its major goals, including nationalization of same-sex marriage, implementation of national health care that includes anti-Christian mandates, and cementing a secular socialist-style government that would replace freedom and biblical values with government dependency.
Right. Sounds about right.
So if it is so small, and as you say, as a movement, not very effectual, why is Tony Perkins so afraid of them?
Well, Sarah, do you actually believe that they believe that? I mean, or do you,
right.
I mean, this is how they've been raising money for decades, right? They've been
right, but right. I mean, obviously that was a fundraising email, but obviously also you go to where I go and do reporting, and people believe that. People believe that there's this huge secular. They've been convinced by Tony Perkins or Jerry Falwell or whomever that there is this huge secular monster, and it's not just a fundraising ploy. I mean, it's a way of making people think that there's this huge enemy of Christianity.
Right. Well, speaking to the secular groups on the ground here in Washington, I've been speaking to a lot of them. They don't think they're a monster. They are constantly complaining that they're just underfunded and outgunned, but they're bravely going forward. So, yes, this is, again, part of this almost PR war that was launched and went on for decades, right, where the Christian right made a mint by tarring secularism as atheism, as liberalism, as communism, as godlessness, as anti-Americanism. So this is just more of the same. And it worked very, very well. And shrewd...
And it continues to.
And it continues. And shrewd secular strategists are going to have to figure out a way, right, to, like, dismantle the bomb, right? They're going to have to learn how to deal with these types of claims, which are fictitious, if you ask me.
Right. Yes, of course they are. Of course they are. But, you know, the big Supreme Court decisions that you talked about, like the 1962 and 63 decisions that held that officially sanctioned school prayer and Bible reading were unconstitutional, came at the height of the Cold War, and, you know, the Christian right back then, such as it was, latched onto those as evidence that America was going the godless route. But, you know, you're saying that these are fictitious claims. Obviously, you know, I agree with you on that. But at the same time, you're saying that secularists have lost the PR war. You're saying that when you look at public opinion polling, that people haven't bought in to separation of church and state. People still think that it's okay for there to be school prayer. I mean, I'm not. You can elaborate on what public opinion polling questions you've been looking at. So if that's, you know, so if the Christian right is, or the Christian revivalists, as you call them in the book, is perpetuating a fiction about who secularists are, it seems like they've been kind of effective at it if the public opinion polling shows that people really believe that the Supreme Court has went down the wrong path 50 years ago with establishing this stronger wall of separation.
Right. Well, it depends what public opinion polling you look at. I mean, things like, do people want the Bible in schools, right? I cite in the book some statistics from the 60s, right, when the cases were argued, and at present, right? And the numbers are depressing. They're about 60 to 70%. Questions like, was America founded?
People think it's 60 to 70% think it's okay to have officially sanctioned schools.
Yeah, they want prayer. They want something, some acknowledgement of God in schools. I mean, there are a lot of statistics in the book that are. It's funny that you're asking this question. I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from. I'm sure it's a solid point you're making, but I'm a little confused at this point because there is a lot of polling data in the book that would seem to indicate that Americans, all right, whoever they are, all right, are deeply dissatisfied with this kind of alleged separationist status quo. All right, maybe we could take it another way. Remember that poll that came out about the religiosity of the members of the Congress? Remember that? And nobody there claimed to be, for example, a non-believer, right? Which I thought was real, even though we know that Pete Stark, right, is an out-of-the-closet non-believer. I don't know how that happened, right? But in any case, right, so you're looking at these kinds of statistics, which I feel again and again show that non-belief, right, and its alehouse drinking partner, right, secularism, are kind of on the outs in American public opinion. Now, non-belief, that's pretty obvious, right? We've seen survey after survey that's indicated that non-believers are irrationally disliked and people wouldn't trust a non-believer to be president, so on and so forth.
Right. So I guess what I'm saying is, you take that as evidence that the secular movement has either failed to persuade people of its intentions and its righteousness.
Right.
But I think that also, we discussed the fiction of the Tony Perkins email, right? But I think it's a fiction that's been effective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as a propaganda tool.
Good fiction often is. Yeah.
Yes, right. So how would a secular movement go about persuading people that we really do need, and we'll get to the question of the strict separationism versus accommodationism in a minute, but how would a secular movement go about persuading people who have been persuaded that we need to post the 10 Commandments in public schools or in courthouses, or we need to have more prayer in public schools, or we need to have more official expression of religious faith? How, given the environment, how would the secular movement go about this persuasion of the public?
All right. Well, I would start by saying different secular strokes for different secular folks, right? There are the liberal religious traditions who can be appealed to with one set of messages, but the much harder sell are the conservative religious traditions in the United States. One thing which I find fascinating, and I think this is a point which really is much more important in the book than the stuff about the new atheists, is the Christian lineage of secularism. And it's something that I've come to the conclusion like 36 professors knew, but nobody else, right? And now it can be told, right? This was known for a while, right? That secularism is an idea that emerges from Christian political philosophy.
Right.
But it's not popular. Excuse me?
You trace it back to Martin Luther.
Right.
Martin Luther was a secularist.
Yeah, if I wanted to bore the screws off every chair in America, I could have traced it back to Augustine and St. Paul, right? That would have been another 4 chapters, and, I don't think this would have been a trade book. But, all right, so let's start there, right? When we claim in the book that secularism grows out of the Christian theological tradition, right, it should mean that there are scriptures there, actual consultable scriptures, which conservative Christians who see secularism as the Antichrist presently can be referred to, right? So an example I give is the following. Jerry Falwell, in the early 60s, prior to completely realigning the American political equation, was what we would call a separationist, right? He was very worried about the civil rights movement, which he associated with communism, and he was very worried about evangelical preachers that were becoming interested in it and were using the pulpit and the public square to advocate on behalf of some type of substantive change vis-a-vis race relations in the United States. So what did Falwell do? He fell back on an ancient Christian intuition. And that intuition goes back to the book of Romans. It goes back to the famous line, to render unto Caesar what is his. Right? These are intuitions that say a Christian ought not get too involved in politics, right? Because those things of this world don't have much to do with the importance of life everlasting in the next, right? So in terms of my outreach project, right, how could secularists possibly make inroads? Well, it depends on the category. But with conservative Christians, quite honestly, there has been a tradition of separatism in what we would call evangelical thought throughout American history. And it might be hard to reignite or turn it back on right now, but I think the theoretical possibility exists.
Right, but I think it's hard to turn back the clock from several generations of conservative evangelicals who've been convinced that it is their Christian duty to get involved in politics and to bring Christian or biblical values to government.
Right. They certainly have been trained to think that, and they've been equipped with valuable communicative skills and intellectual skills to bring that to an end, right? But look, it's worth a try because it goes right back to the text itself, right, which is the inerrant and infallible scriptures. So if I find scriptures that say, well, listen, you know, a good obedient Christian obeys the powers that be, right, and doesn't complain, right, well, I bring that to the attention of Christian folk. I think it's important that they know the scriptures, by the way, right, that they ignore somewhat obvious messages in their scriptures. For example, the oft-heard refrain, "We get our rights from God, not government." The exact same verses I cited would seem to completely kind of upend that or neutralize that logic. So there's a lot of work to be done on that front. I would send the more conservative Christians back to their own scriptures and ask for an open dialogue. And quite frankly, Sarah, when I speak to theologians at conferences, and we're off the record, maybe having a drink in a bar, right?
A drink with a theologian?
Oh, absolutely. They love to drink. They love to carouse, right? You know, they're all party animals. They'll nakedly say it, of course. I mean, this was a part of our tradition, and it's kind of been subdued and lost, but it's always there. And we as Christians, we think about it a lot. We think about what it means, but we're not in that present moment right now.
Well, it's interesting, in the current war on contraception environment, right, the question about church-state separation has been reframed a little bit because a lot of conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals are talking about, well, you know, the government is interfering with our practice and our religious belief by making us provide this insurance to our employees.
Right.
And they're pointing to this case that came down last term from the Supreme Court, the Hosanna Tabor case, which addresses the extent to which, in a very sort of limited circumstance, the extent to which the government can dictate to a religious body definitions of who is a minister and who isn't a minister. Right. And so I think that I think that exposes them to a sort of double that exposes them as adhering to a double standard. Right. By saying, you know, well, we don't think that there's a separation of church and state. Oh, but wait a second, we do think that there's a separation of church and state when the government is trying to tell us what to do. It exposes them to a lot of double standards, right? I think the killer statistic there is something like 90% of Catholics, according to one prominently cited study, have either used or use contraception. Isn't that funny, though? Because now the American government is in a really strange position, right? The American government has the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops telling it, right, this is an infringement on our religious liberty. But what the Catholic bishops are claiming, right, to be doctrine is a doctrine that's being ignored by the overwhelming majority of Catholics in the pews, right? So what is the government supposed to do there? Is it supposed to listen to the representative of Catholicism or the much larger consensual will of the people? Which seems to be saying, yeah, we'd actually like to have access to contraception. That's right. Well, the whole question of conscience exemptions from generally applicable laws is probably too big a topic for us to cover here. But yes,
bring it on. Come on, bring it
on. Well, so another interesting point that you make in the book, which I think is true, is the question of self-identification, and that is that, you know, if a pollster were to call up a conservative evangelical, they'd identify very strongly as, oh, you know, what's your religion? I'm an evangelical. But on the flip side of that, for secularists, it's not a strong identification. It might not be the thing that they first identify themselves as. And I think that that's also true for atheists, non-believers. It may not be the primary way in which they identify themselves as, or identify their belief system.
Right.
And so do you think that that's a problem or a drawback or a difficulty for mobilizing and organizing a movement if secularism is not your number one way or principal way that you identify yourself?
Yeah, I think I was looking for kind of failings in previous ways of thinking through secular movements, right, or even movements in non-belief, and you've said it quite well. One of the problems is that often these movements try to create like a bionic man. They try to rebuild somebody as a secularist, right? Or they try to build an atheist identity. Look, atheist identities, we don't even know what they are yet. We're just learning, right? Let them flourish, right? We have like a greenhouse of different type of atheisms in the United States. There's no one atheist identity. So whereas evangelical Christianity has this advantage, like any religion has, like it's got, a lot of doctrine behind it. It's got 2 millennia of Christian theological speculation to help a person figure out what it means to be an evangelical Christian. Secularism does not have that luxury, right? There is no identity which in and of itself can claim to be secular. I am secular, period, right? So what I propose in the book is we think of secular as an adjective, and we embrace the adjective. And we said the best we're going to get out of our compatriots is to get themselves to say, I am a secular Catholic, I am a secular Jew, I am a secular Latina, so on and so on and so on and so forth. I feel the error the movement made, in some instances, was trying to create fully blown secular identities for people to inhabit. It was like an artificial experiment in which we'd make this identity and somebody would walk into it. Nobody wanted to walk into that identity. So why not just embrace the adjective?
So if they were to frame it that way, so there's recent polling data on people who identify as a none, N-O-N-E, unaffiliated, and that it's increasing, that, it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of the voting population. I mean, do you think that those are the people who are going to be attracted to this, or would it also be people who, when they get called by the pollster and ask them what their religion is, they say, oh, I'm a Protestant, a mainline Protestant, or I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Jew, or I'm Muslim. So you're saying, I think in the book you call it big tent secularism, where it encompasses all of these things, and it may not be the primary way that you identify yourself either religiously or culturally, but that it's sort of like a hyphen.
Exactly. It's precisely that. And that's the best secularism is ever going to do, right? It's going to get many different type of Americans to say, oh yeah, and in addition, I'm secular, right? I'm Catholic and I'm secular. Okay,
so if you say I'm Catholic and I'm secular, what does it mean?
It's very, very simple. It means you're Catholic, right? And in terms of your thinking about how government should interact with religion, right? You share, 1 or 5 or 6 or 7 secular approaches to that question. Easy. It's so easy. I mean, everything else is such a dead lift trying to create people who have an identity. And this identity is secular, right? I'm just asking for people to recognize that they see value in the political potentiality or the political solutions that are offered by secularism, right? And I actually think most Americans do.
Notwithstanding the fact that there are these majorities who think that we should have more prayer in public schools.
Yeah, this is where the secular leadership and the secular movement has failed, right? They have failed to explain to Americans what they mean by this, right? And I could boil it down to one word. Here's one possibility. Go this way, disestablishmentarianism. I know it's 10 syllables and whatnot, right? But I think most Americans, even conservative Christian evangelical Americans, don't want to live under somebody else's establishment, right? If secularism were to...
Yes, but they do want to live under their own.
Exactly. But if secularism were to pitch it that way, in a society where we have what James Madison referred to in Federalist 10 as a multiplicity of sects, all of a sudden you've got a game-changing possibility. Nobody wants to live under a conservative evangelical establishment. And even with an evangelical...
Well, the conservative evangelicals do.
Well, hold it. Evangelicalism is not, as you know very well, it's not one religion, right? It's para-denominational. There are a lot of different types of Christians, right, who refer to themselves as evangelicals, right? And what I'd like to see, I'm wondering, would it ever come to this, right? But if one of those groups, let's say Baptists, right, had a chance to impose an establishment on another group, right? And wouldn't that be one of the greatest ironies ever, right? My surmise is another, like we could say maybe kind of evangelicals within, the Methodist fold, let's say. My surmise is they would push back and say, no, we don't want that. So getting conservative Christians to realize what we're playing for is this, all right? We're playing for an end game in which you never have to be subjected to the religion of anyone else, right? And quite frankly, there's a high likelihood that if anyone is going to subject anyone else to a religion, right, it's going to be evangelical Christians subjecting other evangelical Christians, right? Evangelicalism is a big thing. It's not just one homogenous religion, and there are lots of internal fissures and tensions within evangelicalism.
It is true. That would definitely come to the fore if we ever reach the point where there was some kind of imposition of some kind of evangelical religion coming from the government. But at the same time, I think that the Christian right as a political movement has been very successful in promoting this idea that our government should be guided by quote unquote biblical values. But as you say, that's not particularly well defined. And so what it would turn out to be might be the subject of some intra-evangelical debate at some point.
Huge.
But in the meantime, I think you're right.
They speak in code. They say, we want faith. We just want more faith. That's all they say, right? And that brings so many other actors, right, into their kind of Big Ten, perhaps not understanding what exactly they mean by faith. I don't think they mean faith. I think, and, they have every right. I think they really mean their particular understanding of Christianity. That's what they want to bring into government, right? As every group does.
Of course, yeah. So you have a chapter where you talk about, this is where we'll get to the question of pure separationism versus accommodationism, and where you ask the question, is the Democratic Party secularist? And you discuss the Obama's Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, which was an evolution from George W. Bush's Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, which, as you point out, had serious constitutional church-state separation questions surrounding it, and that some of which Obama hasn't corrected, which is something that I've written more words than I ever thought I would have to.
Can I just say, you've done some really, really important work on that, and I'm very appreciative. I've learned a lot about that from you, Sarah. So,
oh, well, thank you.
Tip your hat to yourself.
But I guess, so something that wasn't quite clear to me. So I guess I have taken a kind of strict separationist view of the faith-based office, because it seems to me that, having watched the discussions of the advisory council that Obama appointed right after he established the office, that there were some fairly straightforward things that could have been done to avoid the Establishment Clause problems with the federal government funding these groups. One was to require houses of worship to set up a separate 501c3 to receive the funds. So it's like, okay, I'm Catholic and my faith calls me to feed the hungry. It's like, great, you set up your, simple, streamlined, the IRS could set up a simple, streamlined way of getting this separate organization so that everything's separate and there's no question.
It's so easy.
It's so easy, right? And then, and so I guess, there were some simple things that they could have done that they didn't do. The hiring issue is huge, I think, and particularly in light of the recent discovery that the Justice Department has a practice of granting exemptions to organizations that ask for it. So you can basically say, I'd like to discriminate in hiring with my federal taxpayer money, and if you make the request, the Justice Department could be granting that request, although we don't know that much about it. So why do you think that the Obama administration has not done those simple things that would address the concerns of the separationists while keeping the faith-based project intact for the people who say they want the faith-based project.
And I think it goes back to our earlier, I don't think they give a hoot about the separationists. It's not, let's put it this way. The African-American community often, I remember this in New York in the 70s and 80s, consistently voted Democratic, right, for the Democrats. And at one point they turned around and they asked themselves, wait, what exactly are we getting from them again? Right? We keep giving them our vote, right? But we're not getting anything in return, right? So let's shift this to secular separationists, right? The Obama administration need not concern itself with the fears and the cries and the laments of secular separationists because there's no money to be shown if we're going to have a show me the money. Secular separationists can't do as much for the Obama administration as liberal Catholics can, right? As Methodists can, as Jews can, right? And this goes right back to the core of the problem that I'm trying to describe in the book. So you ask, it's a good question, why doesn't Obama make these token gestures, right, to make the separationists happy? And the answer is because he doesn't have to.
Well, that's definitely true. But so what you're saying, if secularism encompassed, the liberal Catholics and you point out in the book that it does already essentially encompass the Jews, that maybe those folks would be allies, but I do think the separationists do have allies. I mean, if you look at the composition, religious allies, if you look at the composition of the Coalition Against Religious Discrimination, which has advocated for changing the hiring rule, that it includes the Union for Reform Judaism, or I guess not the Union for, but the RAC, the
Reform Action Committee,
political arm, the Reform Action, the Baptist Joint Committee, which I think you also discussed in the book. I mean, there are other faith groups that are part of that coalition who are concerned about those separation issues. So that's already there.
It's already there. It has yet to be pieced together, right? Here's some good news, all right? My conversations in Washington, right, are leading me to the conclusion. These were not conversations I could have had in New York. My conversations in Washington are leading me to the conclusion that there is a heightened intelligence around secular activism over the last year or so. And I think things are actually getting better and people are getting smarter and they're thinking more about PR and they're thinking about building coalitions and they're reaching out to the religious moderates, right? And they're understanding, this whole business with the billboards in North Carolina. Remember that, Sarah, right? That maybe that's not the way to go, to kind of just, in your face it, right? For gratuitous pleasure to various religious communities. So my sense, and this is like my latest thought, is that things are actually starting to take shape and perk up and get a lot more crafty and intelligent among secular thinkers. With that said, right, there's been this kind of brain drain / strategist, tactician drain in the movement's thinking, and up to the present, this is what we're seeing. But maybe things are getting better.
Well, that's hopeful. Well, one thing I thought was fairly interesting recently, I mean, the Secular Coalition for America, which is an umbrella of mostly secular and atheist groups, recently hired as its executive director a Republican.
Edwina Rogers, yep.
Yes, which was, I thought, kind of remarkable. I don't know. There's got to be Republican secularists out there.
Sure. It might have been the single smartest thing that any secular movement has done in the last decade, because she has a thick and dense background in bringing coalitions together. Remember that word, the coalition word? Right? So, I mean, their whole thing is build, work through Washington, right? Monitor the media, monitor academe, speak to Republicans, speak to Democrats. Remember how I said a moment ago that, Obama doesn't have to listen to separationists, right? Because he doesn't have to, right? So the natural move is to try to find some type of sympathetic ear amongst Republicans, right? And anecdotal evidence suggests there are Republicans, right, who are non-believers, all right? I meet them all the time in Washington, right?
Right.
And
but they won't admit it.
Excuse me?
They won't admit it.
They won't admit it, right? Some will.
They're in the closet. They're in the closet. It's
Some
like
are.
gay
But then
Republicans.
and this is crucial, those old school moderate Republicans, right, that started being kind of wiped out with Darwinian
Yeah,
philosophy.
I was going to say, aren't they extinct now?
True, but they're still in Washington, D.C. They're still there. They're at think tanks, right? Some of them might be, considering another run for Congress. Some of them might be working, for a senator. So these are the people I meet in Washington all the time, these Republicans, right? They're the old school moderates. They don't know what has happened to their party. So if Secular Coalition of America is indeed speaking to these Republicans on a monthly or weekly basis, that's pretty intelligent, if you ask me. All right, so I applaud them in that regard, and I do think there's a lot of positive energy there, and I think they're making some interesting, intriguing, out of the box choices. Right, so maybe that's a good sign.
Right. So back to the faith-based office. So there's I guess different permutations or schools of thought on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and I think that there are people who I think you would characterize as strict separationists who would say, I prefer not to have that at all. I would just prefer to have the government not funding any faith-based organizations.
Right.
And then I think the approach that Obama obviously has taken is what you might describe as an accommodationist approach, where it's like, well, we think that there should be this funding, but we'll kind of massage it around the edges to assuage the concerns of the separationists about whether there is an improper mingling of religion and government.
Right.
So where do you fall on that spectrum? I mean, do you think that having a faith-based office at all is a good idea?
No, I think it's a terrible idea. But I'm a realist, right? And in one of those footnotes, I think it's chapter 8 of the book, there was an article that really kind of shocked me. And it's deep at the end of chapter 8. It's in the footnotes. And it was a guy speaking about how accommodationism is like on the ground everywhere. Like separationism is so done, right? In state houses across America, right? Governors are partnering with religious groups, right? Often it helps them with their budgets, right? So what good does it do secularism to speak in a separationist dialogue, right? Or to kind of scream out mantras about total separationism, right? When the whole rest of the country is moving in the direction of accommodationism, right? And these are the kinds of pragmatic choices in the book that I just try to get secular people to think about. I mean, everybody says they want total separation. I don't know if I want total separation. I don't know if it's possible. And where it's actually been enacted, it's been a little bit creepy, okay? Nevertheless, I like a good soft separationism, vintage 1960, 1970, right? Everyone has their own preference. I do like that type of separationism, right?
Yeah.
But what good does it do me to keep clinging to that dream of 1960-style separationism, where like 40 governors in 40 states in the United States are living the accommodationist worldview out on a daily basis, right? So the conversation is occurring around accommodationism, not around separationism. And I want to repeat, Sarah, secular intellectuals have been so slow to imbibe this. This is what's puzzling to me, right? The secularists, according to Rick Santorum, are the smart people, right? And they're the elite and so on. They've been out-thought. I mean, there's just so much more energy amongst conservative Christian scholars, right? They're really thinking hard about these problems, and they're laying out paradigms, and they have conferences, and they speak to one another, and they often say things that are really, really interesting and grounded, by the way, in fact. And I'm just looking for the secular intelligentsia. And I'm trying to figure, where did it go? Who was steering the ship in 1995, in 2000? And I'm speaking a lot to professors and whatnot. So I think this is really, really a big problem.
So what do you make of the role of religious talk? We religion reporters call it the God talk in the presidential campaign, right? So, I mean, just this week, I got an email from the Obama campaign. Attached is our faith platform. President Obama is a committed Christian, and his faith informs his values, and yada 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 yada.
Yada yada yada.
Which is good, yeah. And I understand the whole question of like people don't really think that voters don't really believe that Obama is a Christian, and they think he might be a Muslim, which is of course like who cares if he were really a Muslim? But anyway, so I understand that they've got this fake issue that they have to deal with.
Right.
But even setting that aside, I mean, I just find it as it's sort of separating my personae and thinking about this as a voter as opposed to as a journalist. When I get this thing and read it about reminding me what a committed Christian President Obama is, I kind of think, I don't care.
Yeah.
And and also, why does that, so if he wasn't a committed Christian, because I'm not a Christian,
right.
So does that somehow make him better to be a committed Christian? It's sort of a suggestion of that, and it kind of bothers me, and I just wonder, I'm probably an outlier. I think maybe a lot of voters like that.
Well, they probably do. I mean, it is very, very grating, and non-believers and non-Christians and even some Christians, maybe not even a lot of Christians, right, find it really ponderous. You noticed, Sarah, that he proclaimed 9/7 to 9/9 days of prayer and repentance, I believe, for the 9/11 memorial. Now, let me ask you this, all right? And I speak as a person who lived across from the World Trade Center, right, on the day these terrible things happened, and I've experienced that very, very deeply. Do we need those 2 days as Americans to properly focus and think about what happened on that awful day in 2001? I mean, did Obama really need to call that 9/7 to 9/9, that proclamation for a day of prayer and whatever, vis-a-vis 9/11? So these are things that the Obama administration does, right? A couple of us were writing about this in 2006, 2007, and people were telling us we were crazy, right? We were like, oh my God, the Democrats, they're not separationists anymore, right? So we were screaming fire in a movie theater, right? And many did not agree with us. They're like, you're nuts. The Democrats defend the secular vision. And we kept saying, oh my God, no, you don't realize that. And I think we've really come to have undeniable empirical proof that the Democrats have moved away from the old separationist paradigm. They are very comfortable in accommodationism. And Sarah, they're very smart people, Democrats. It just might be that their polling indicated, in fact, I do think I know this for a fact, their polling indicated that separationist secularism was an electoral loser. And I'm even going to put up the loser sign. Wait, can you see that? Oh, you can't see it, but here it is, loser. Loser. Electoral loser. So as an electoral loser, they decided that they didn't want to lock arms with it anymore. And I think, Sarah, that's why we get these missives and these bulletins from the White House telling us about the president's faith. And yes, of course, I wish it wouldn't happen, but I do think we have to just kind of understand that's politics. That's what politicians have to do. Okay. Well, we'll probably continue this conversation. You'll come back on later on in the presidential campaign. We'll talk about it more. Absolutely.
How's that sound?
That sounds great. This is really fun. I can't wait to see it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I see me. I can't wait to see you.
All right. Thanks, Jacques.
Thank you so much, Sarah.